dividends, this is a rare event, I understand, then this place was substantial.
The Caribou Amelia was the first lode gold mine in British Columbia, Mike, to pay dividends. It paid over $100,000 in 1894 and 1895. That was a lot of money then. And people said this was the beginning. It was really the beginning of the lode gold promise and discoveries all through that southern interior country. It started with the Caribou Amelia.
Okay. When we take a look at other places we've talked about, like Rossland, where there was the Roy mines,
yeah,
those all came later.
They were all later than this Camp McKinney. Camp McKinney was the first.
Okay. Some of the other people that we're talking about at this location who move into town, I guess always you're looking at the merchants and
Sure.
And some of these names are remarkable because the Cousins Bay on Kalamalka Lake, is that related to the Cousins who owned that store?
Well,
down
you know,
there?
I can't tell you offhand, but certainly Cousins was an old Okanagan family, and so was the name next to it. And this is Shatford, and Shatford, of course, was Senator Shatford, and he came from the South Okanagan as well. So the Okanagan merchants were quick into Camp McKinney, and this shows Camp McKinney, but still at kind of the formative stage, 1890s, and not really a bona fide city, but really a mining camp.
This looks more like a resort lodge than one of the hotels, but this is...
Yeah, this is probably the Caribou Hotel. Now, you must be aware that it was an interesting camp because there were half a dozen hotels. There was the Caribou Hotel and the McKinney and the St. Louis and the Miners Exchange and a couple of others.
So that was where the miners hung their hats, if they weren't at the bunkhouse of the Little Caribou.
Most of them. Right.
This is a little more modern, I guess, up-to-date style hotel, false front, but
yeah.
Whose hotel is this?
Huey Cameron's, probably the Sailor Hotel in Camp McKinney. And this is probably taken around the turn of the century or just prior to the turn of the century, typical of the hotels of its day.
And the characters that pose for these photographs out in front of these hotels, do you know who any of these characters are?
No, but I imagine Huey Cameron was there. And there were a lot of fascinating characters in Camp McKinney. And, of course, our central story revolves around one of these guys, a guy called Matthew Roderick, generally known as Matt Roderick.
What line of work was he in, professionally?
Well, he was a mining engineer. But he chose a different route. He became a high-stakes gambler, and because of his high-stakes gambling, he became a highwayman.
So that's an interesting route from university to the School of Hard Knocks.
Oh, yeah, very fascinating character.
Matt Roderick.
Matt Roderick.
Sounds like a name out of the Old West.
Yeah, well, it is, actually. He was an American. We don't know exactly where he came from, but he drifted into Camp McKinney, and this leads us to the central story of the old gold brick robbery.
Now, as you already pointed out, the mines at Camp McKinney were regularly pouring bricks of gold. Now, what would happen to those bricks of gold? Where would they go?
Well, it's rather interesting, Mike, because there were significant numbers of bricks coming out of Camp McKinney at this particular time, and they would send out several shipments a month, usually, and the shipments would range from 500 to 700 ounces each, poured into a crude brick. So it'd be cast 2 or 3 or 4 bricks, depending how much they'd produced up to that point, and they'd be carried down from Camp McKinney, down the old stagecoach road into Midway. Then they'd be transshipped into Spokane, which was the headquarters of the Caribou Amelia.
And they do this, what, daily, weekly?
Well, usually once every couple of weeks.
Yeah. Obviously, that was a great lure for a engineer come highwayman who was losing at the high-stakes table.
Yeah, but it's an interesting story. And what happened was this. On the 18th of October, 1896, just short of 100 years ago, a guy called Macaulay, George Macaulay, who was a large shareholder of the mine, loaded several bricks into the wagon which carried the gold bricks down in the Midway, and used an express bag to put the bricks in. Mm-hmm. So he carried that in the seat beside him, and loaded this express bag on board, went down the trail several miles, and there in the center of the trail, according to his version, if we believe it, a highwayman stepped out in front of him, and this is McMinn's Meadows, right close to this spot here. Highwayman stepped out in front of him, leveled a Winchester at him, and said, throw out the gold bricks. And he did not hesitate. He threw the old express bags down on the road and was told to whip his horses and get out of here, which he did.
So the gold bricks would be in bags very similar to these. These are not ones from that scene, but no, this is the way they'd be carried.
Very similar to that. They'd be carried inside the flap, and 1 or 2 bricks on either side. He was carrying at that time over 600 ounces of gold made into crude bricks.
So, and at $20 an ounce, this is...
At that time, $12,000. Now, worth well over $300,000.
All right. Well, that sounds like a robbery. Who were the characters that were implicated in it?
Well, it's an interesting story that unfolds as time goes on. So Macaulay then goes down to Midway, and he rouses the two constables, a guy called McMinn and Dinsmore. The McMinns are still in the Midway country, and they come back to McKinney and search the immediate area, and they come across where the guy had sat down and had himself a little drink, so there's some empty bottles there, and that's all they find. They don't know anything about it. But the company is not happy with this at all, the Caribou Amelia Company. So the president of the company offers a reward of $3,500. A lot of money in 1896, Mike. And as a result of that, he gets an anonymous letter from a guy who would evidently met Roderick in Orville, or Old Oro, which is just on the U.S. side. And they were drinking in a saloon there. And after their drinking bout, Roderick suggested they knock off the gold wagon coming out of Camp McKinney. Well, he travels with Roderick to Camp McKinney, but decides against it. He goes on to Rossland, the old Golden City. But then he hears about the robbery, so he writes back that maybe Matt Roderick is implicated. So the company then searches for the name Roderick. Yes, it's on their payroll, and he had booked off sick the day of the robbery.
And what date was that?
That was August the 18th, 1896.
All right. Now, on that day, he booked off sick.
Yeah.
Where did he go to after that?
Well, that's interesting, because not only did he book off sick, but several days later, he left by stagecoach, probably haul lines, and left heading for the west and disappeared out of Camp McKinney. But somebody saw him aboard the stagecoach, and they were quite sure that he was not carrying any luggage that would have concealed 600 ounces of gold. But indeed, he may have been carrying a small bar, because there was a small bar and two large bars. And that was evidently the case, because the company then put Pinkerton detectives on his tail. They followed him to Seattle, and he stayed in a boarding house there for several weeks, actually almost 2 months. And he was spending money rather lavishly, which they felt he should not have. And they felt that he was spending the proceeds from the small bar that had been on the stage. So they followed him, and eventually he left Seattle, boarded a train, and came east again. Stopped at the old town of Concanelli in the state of Washington, bought a horse, a dapple gray horse, from the sheriff there, which is kind of surprising, and then rode north into Loomis, another old mining town, then came up through Loomis and came up to Nighthawk, and up past Nighthawk, and up into the country we've discussed before in another program, which is the Speaking Rock country.
Okay. Now, as he came into that area, what did they suspect him of? The Pinkertons at this time were saying, what were their suspicions?
They notified the Canadian authorities, and the Canadian authorities were then, that was their responsibility from then on.
And who did the Canadian authorities appoint to be their representative?
They appointed the most logical guy in the Okanagan or the Southern Interior, and surprisingly, he was an Indian. His name was Long Alex. He was a chief of the Inukini Reserve, actually an Okanagan Indian. Here he is on his famous white horse, and he's in an old mining camp. This happens to be Fairview, and he patrolled that country from Fairview through Camp McKinney into Greenwood, all that southern interior. He was allowed to arrest not only Indians, but also whites. He was a bona fide lawman.
He struck an imposing figure aboard that horse, and he was a very big man.
Oh, you bet he was. He was at least 6'4", perhaps 6 feet 5 inches, hence his name, Long Alex.
Here he is wearing the badge of respect.
You bet. This is a lawman's badge, and is pinned right there. And the interesting thing, he's with his wife Mary here. This is probably taken on the Inukini Reserve, which is down just off Lake Osoyoos. And his gun, which he wore all the time, is strapped on in the Canadian lawman's way. It is on his left side. That's a crossover reach. That's the mounted police reach, not similar to the American officers who wore their guns on the right-hand side.
Was he some kind of a historical anomaly? I mean, it doesn't strike me that there were a lot of Indian police officers.
Perhaps not as famous as Long Alex, but they knew this guy knew the trails and the back roads and all that country like the back of his hand.
So, Long Alex got the job of picking up Roderick's trail?
Of picking up Roderick's trail.
How successful was he in that?
Well, of course, he knew it. He followed Roderick like a shadow. And so Roderick came coming over the old Fairview Road into Camp McKinney in late October of 1896 to pick up the other 2 gold bricks that he had cached somewhere in the immediate area. But however, there were 2 other men who were interested. And one was a guy called Joe Keene, and he had a man called Deans with him. So we had Long Alex on one trail and Keene and Deans on another trail. And as it happened, and by the time Matt Roderick came riding up through that half light of the dying day, they were on the right trail. So Joseph Keynes, and who